Hello, everyone. It is July 27th, 2021. I have to say that just for the timestamp sake. And this is Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play. And we're having our sixth death chat with the lovely, and I'll let you all introduce yourselves.
Julia D. Caneba, and I just have an insatiable curiosity for all the things.
And I'm Lauren Yeat. I'll also do this. I'm a cultivator of curiosity, and I work with This Us Now doing things, and I love chatting with everybody about everything.
And now, so we have explored many different things on this conversation. We've now had probably 8 to 10 hours of talks about death. And what are some of the things that we have not covered that we are actually fascinated to to cover?
I will jump in and say I feel like it's been really great and interesting, fascinating to talk about a thing that nobody talks about on a regular basis. A lot of what we focused on though is individual, if you knew you were going to die, or what do you want to do before, the bucket list things and stuff like that. But I feel like we haven't gotten to talk about, okay, when it's no longer about you because you're not here, and whoever is left, when we have experienced losing somebody else, or in theory, if we're gone, whoever is left surviving us, friends or family or people that we've impacted that we may or may not know. I think we briefly touched on that, but that's a whole nother realm of the people having to deal with death that is not their own.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the emotional part, but then there's also the gross business part. Some of it's gross, some of it's gross business, some of it's business.
Yeah, the intersection of humanity and business. And I think that also really, that intersection of healthcare and death is really big, both from a familial standpoint and the people left behind, and then from the actual side of the doctors and the whole system. So I feel like those are very neatly intertwined.
I don't know. There's I don't know if you remember or you've helped with a funeral, but it is horrible. And it's horrible not in just the sense of you just lost somebody, but it's horrible that someone is trying to upsell you on a coffin or an urn or a plot of land, and it's it's so complicated. And you feel like you're buying a car when you just want to mourn during this time, and instead they're trying to explain to you the whole process, and then make you feel guilty when you don't want to get the nicest coffin or the nicest urn. And it's dude, what is this? What world have I stepped into?
Not in a specific complaining sense. It could be good or bad experiences, but I'd be intrigued to find out your all experiences with losing other people. It's not fun to talk about exactly, but I do think that there's a validity in when you've experienced it for the first time, it feels very potentially earth-shattering, or nobody knows how I feel, but people do. It's just different, or people haven't really processed it out loud or talked about it out loud, or their experiences. And so when you are experiencing it for the first time, I think it's very it's jarring for many reasons. Jeff, kind of what you were talking about, I had my dad passed away a while ago, but it was just me and my sister. And so we were the ones, there was an executor of a trust who managed some stuff, but we were we are making decisions on what we want to do. And also okay, not just we've lost a person, but also, okay, there's this house, we have to deal with a funeral or service, or what do we do with actually moving things forward. What were all of the logistics of their life that you now have to sort of manage and be do we close how many credit cards do we have to close, and like death certificate, like all of the paperwork process. And I think that for me, it was interesting because me and my sister, obviously same family, and sometimes we're a couple years apart, and sometimes we're super similar, but then other times we're like, wow, we're super different people. And she was much more of like an emotional processor, and I was much more of a like, I'm gonna take care of shit. Like I'm gonna do things because I don't know what else to do right now. And so that was just an interesting process. But then when I don't remember if he decided or we decided what happened, but we were going to cremate. And then when we were at the like, I guess is it a funeral home or the mortuary?
Crematorium. I mean,
the place. The place.
Yeah, the funeral parlor. Did you go to the funeral?
It's a little bit hazy. There was a lot happening. But we were there, the guy was like, we were sitting in a room, it's super awkward. There's like urn examples on a shelf, and they're like sitting and like talking in a very quiet, calming voice. And there's like, and then what do you want to do? And they're like, open this like pamphlet of catalog options. And it was just like, well, we're gonna cremate, so just like we just need to do that. Like, what do you need? It's like, well, here's like this base level thing, but like, you know, if you want to like pay respect and honor your people, it's like, we're gonna burn a box. Like, what are you like? I kind of like looked at my sister like, no, this is fine. Like, I feel we were in a space like enough to be like, no, but also like the idea that it's sales and that there are people in this like terrible, emotional, vulnerable space, and people are potentially taking advantage of people in this sucky time. And that was just like infuriating.
So infuriating.
Yeah. I know I can't be alone.
No.
I remember there was a coffin, and then there was the outer coffin. There was an outer thing, and you had to buy both. And then you had to look on the inside, like, what kind of fabric do you want? And like, you know, what kind of fabric did he like? And it's like, seriously, this is what we're talking about? Like, I just was on a flight at 2 a.m. because my mom told me, I was on a flight. Yeah, I think my flight was maybe at 4 a.m., but my mom told me at 2 a.m. when my dad died. I'm on a flight at 4 a.m. and then I'm sitting in that funeral parlor at noon. So this just happened. And they are like trying to upsell you on silks. And then be like, hell, you know, do you want the TV package? Because then we can have TVs playing certain. I was like, you're a bunch of a-holes, dude. Like
totally.
This is not right. This is not right at all.
I mean, that feels icky even when you're planning a wedding, much less like, oh, instead, someone you love just died and you're still trying to reconcile that in your head, and you have to pay for all of this and figure all of that out. I mean, I was really grateful that when my mother-in-law died, she was like very, very adamant that we would just have like a party. Like, she will be cremated. End of story. No wake, no announcement, you know, like no nothing, stuff like that. So what we ended up doing then was I ostensibly made an invitation and I emailed it out to people, and then they could come to the party like at the end of the week or whatever. However, I can't remember, the timing is a blur.
Yeah.
But and I was so grateful that we had some semblance of an idea of like, this is what she would have wanted us to do, and like, fuck all the upselling. Because I also see the side of like the funeral home, there's not a lot of profit margin in the basics of like death care, but it all kind of like went left at some point. And I think there's a big reckoning happening right now in the funeral home industry.
Ooh, interesting.
There's just like whisperings of that, especially from a like racism standpoint.
Ooh.
But also from a like, where did the humanity go? Like, how can we get back to this. One of my favorite authors, Caitlin Doughty, founded the sort of an alternative funeral home in LA, which she's now kind of rolled into this company called Clarity Funerals. And they're trying to take the ickiness out of death care. They're still giving you options of things that you want, but they're just giving you like a shroud and a casket or something to pick the thing that suits you, but not to like upsell you on it.
Right.
And so
right.
they're trying to, I think, like ostensibly franchise. I don't know if that's what happens in the death world.
Well,
yeah.
If you could you expand on like the death reckoning, you know, because what I heard recently on TikTok, and I can't find the video now, but I'll send it if I find it. They were talking about how at one point death doulas was like a thing back in like the early like 20th century, like 1920, 1930. And then it was looked down upon. It was actually demonized. And they might have done them. This might have existed many times, not just like then, but and each time, like anything that went against what the funeral industry was communicating was like deemed as horrible. When like the idea that someone would be helping you transition through death, just like through birth, that's fascinating me. Like, wow, that would be really amazing. Why does that not even exist in hospice care? Like, is there
it does in the UK. Yeah. Lauren, you look like you have a question.
I do often. I do want to, I know Jeff asked about like whatever reckoning more that you've heard about, but I also want to just get clarity on, like, I've heard of doulas for like
birth doulas,
labor, birth, pregnancy, but I had not heard of death doulas before, like now. Like, is that for the individual or their people or both? Like what do either of you know about that? Just for a context.
So the context that I'll give you is I had a photo shoot in December of 2019 where I met the photographer's name is Caroline, and she had done a Lua Arthur's program. Her company is called Going with Grace, and she's kind of like a leader in the death doula industry. But there are many other programs, and there's several other death doulas who I follow on Instagram, things like that. So the knowledge that I know is as much as I've kind of garnered from following these people and listening to what they're doing. And so my understanding is that in the same way that a birth doula kind of, they set their own boundaries for what they're doing. So some birth doulas will go stay with the family for a few weeks and cook meals and help them get ready and help them with the nursery. And some are just there for the process of the birth and kind of coaching on that. So in that same way, I think death doulas are kind of making their own paths, because a lot of them do end of life planning. They'll do end of life planning with like terminally ill people and then have their families incorporated in that process. Then they literally sit by someone's bedside while they're physically dying. They just sort of like all number of things. And I think that the level of support in some sense really depends on the person and what they've chosen, to my understanding of it.
Interesting.
There's a lot of people who do volunteer work as death doulas for hospice. So they're starting to kind of ease their way in, and like the Zen Hospice Project organization, I can't remember what they're like a Zen meditation based in San Francisco, and they don't call themselves death doulas, but that's ostensibly what they're doing, is they're ushering people through this final transition.
Gotcha.
This is interesting. I'm looking at this at Wikipedia. So, you know, the alternative death care movement, the death midwife or death doula phenomenon is associated with the death positive movement. It
Mhm.
has also been linked to increased interest in alternative methods of dealing with remains, including green burial, conservation burials, and home burials. And then death doulas are trained to have the knowledge to provide the family with afterlife alternative death care options. So it's also just super interesting like that. Why is this not more popular? Or why is this not like I even read on the wiki thing that a lot of them do it on a volunteer basis, or like it's not a very like death is happening all the time, you know, what exactly happens in hospice? Like I don't even know what goes on in hospice care. Do
Mm.
they talk about stuff there? Like what actually? Yeah.
Yes and no. If I can keep talking since I've been talking a lot, but
You have
also
knowledge.
like
Please share.
the US versus the UK, like a lot of palliative care in the UK is about palliative care, where acknowledging that someone's physical state might not ever get better. And the point of palliative care is to make them feel as comfortable and as happy as possible. And whatever that kind
And
of
palliative means
means like lessening, like
okay.
if you looked it up in the dictionary, it means like to
Like
mitigate sort of.
Okay, like reducing the burden.
Yeah, I think of it as like putting on a squishy like suit, like you're just like you're easing into it, kind of palliative care. It's just to make you feel better. Quality of life is the focus as opposed to extending life. Whereas hospice care in the US is often more this person is coming to very clearly is coming to the end of their physical life. And it might be longer, but it's usually more like just a couple weeks. The person's already showing signs of like deterioration, it's just normal. And so they're there to not resuscitate, not go the extra mile to keep them alive. They're just there to manage their symptoms and make it sort of as quiet of an experience as they can. So the difference being someone might be in palliative care for a lot longer than hospice because they're terminal, but they have several years left to live, but they still have symptoms of pain and things like that. So
interesting.
There's a little bit of a disconnect. Part of it is like in the US, the healthcare system is like, no one can die. If someone dies during a surgery, it's like labeled a failure. Like literally it's a name that they give it. And it's like, this everything must be done at all costs.
Yeah.
No matter what. Even if sometimes you have an advance directive and you've told them, just let me go if I'm X, Y, or Z.
Right.
They won't always look at it and they won't always respect that because they've just been trained to extend your life at all costs. But
because is that because also they're just worried about getting sued?
Yeah, I think because they're just coming from this idea that like we're here to fix you and make you better. And in certain cases, yeah, they save a life. My friend had a heart attack. She coded twice. She's still alive, going strong, like totally renewed view on life. Like, yeah, there's a lot of instances where that makes a lot of sense, but there are also a lot that it doesn't make sense and that's not what the person wanted. So that's part of what end of life planning is. One of the biggest things is like advanced directives and living wills and like healthcare proxies, because it's like, well, I'm not like old. So people are like, I'm fine, but I would want everyone to know what I want. Anyway, okay. I have so many thoughts, so I will surrender the floor. Yeah.
Great and important and knowledge.
All the things, yeah.
Like Jeff is processing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just fascinated with this idea of palliative care versus hospice care because even the word hospice, right? I've never heard that word hospice used in any other context where it's just basically being like, yeah, they're in hospice care, which means they're dead. They're basically dead. And, you know, I don't know, America. I don't know if it's just in America, but definitely Americans, especially in the corporate world, have like ways of using words to, you know, nullify or pad a really big, like scary word. Like, what was it? Instead of people getting uh laid off or, you know, people fired, they use this other word like reco or some other fancy word to basically be like, we're letting half, if not third, 75% of you go, but we're going to use this or reorganize, or they would say something like reorganizing, we're reorganizing the
Yeah.
organization. You know, I
It's like
feel
a
the same thing with
euphemism.
hospice, where it's just like, yeah, they're in hospice care. It's, it's the last piece of their, but like, what is actually happening in hospice care? Like, who is there? Are they trained in like talking about death? Is that even something that is being talked about? Or is the whole time, like when people come to visit at hospice, like, is there no process? Is there no like, I don't know, way of saying goodbye? And like, I feel like there's more that can be done and it currently is not. Because whenever last year I went to visit someone in hospice care during COVID, and we had to sit outside her window, and like, she was our music teacher, so we were singing to her. And I think I told the story already. And but she was there alone. She was there like alone. Like, it did not look like, and I was thinking she was actually getting visitors, people visiting her in her window. What about everybody else? Like, you don't want to die alone. Like, you don't want to, and it felt like so alone. Yeah.
This is a little bit of a maybe a tangent, but that made me think of like how, again, a lot of our talks have been about like ourselves, and like that idea of like, you don't want to be alone. Like, it doesn't feel like it's hard. But then there's also like a point where it's like, okay, you don't want to be alone, and it is about you. But then like, once that threshold passes, and then it is about everybody else. And also that weird tension of like, kind of like you were just talking about with healthcare and medical people trying to do like at all cost stuff. Like, I feel like there's, in the United States at least, that's where we are, um sort of death being a taboo topic, and people are not comfortable with it. Like, we see like murdery things in video games and movies, but it's like not a natural part of life that gets like talked about very often. And in a similar way, like, again, death for the people left behind is really hard, because at a certain point, like, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what I'm feeling because I'm not here anymore. And it's whatever everyone else is going to deal with. But also, when it is a not as sudden of a thing, but if it's a process of dying, like, there's also a thing of the family and loved ones also like not like at all costs. Like, I just want to keep you around. Just like, yeah, but like, are they like happy or like functioning? Okay, like, and that's like a whole another like the before, the pre and post tensions of what other people feel about not their own, like other people's death.
Yeah. You bring up actually a really good point about, uh, Alzheimer's, because there's death in that. There's death before death. My former roommate of mine, Aya, used to work at CPMC in San Francisco, and she mostly worked with Alzheimer's patients. And she would watch, and she loved hanging out with them. They played music and they like draw, and she'd be like, these are really fascinating, interesting people. She was an expressive arts therapist. That's what she does, bringing value to these people's lives. But they're also kind of like kids in some ways. So when their family came by, when their like sons and daughters came by and saw them acting like a kid, not remembering who they were, the death of who that person was, they almost felt like that was the funeral, like they were. And it was so depressing or tough for Aya, because she was just like, you might have lost the person that you loved, but there's still this really amazing, fascinating person that's still here if you want to hang out with them. But people didn't want to do that. They wanted their mom and dad back. They wanted their grandma and grandpa back.
Yeah. There's so much there. I mean, I was just recently, my therapist, he specializes in young adult cancer patients and survivors and thrivers and all the people. But he also has a very strong focus on just grief and loss and how, as a society, not only do we not talk about death, but we don't talk about any of these small losses of identity, losses of your home. I mean, even when you move house and you're so excited to move to the new place, the whole identity of you in this current place is gone. And I think it's just most jarring. It's the one that we cannot ignore is Alzheimer's, because you're just, it's just so, you're confronted with it. My mom took care of her dad for what felt like a million years, easily 10 years of my life, from like when I was in middle school until he died when I was in college. And he had Alzheimer's, and she would visit him every single day. And it's still just, it's hard to reconcile that version of them. And there's glimmers of who they used to be. Like, he still, till the day he died, he still remembered that he hated water. And so we would give him a cup of water and he would drink and he'd go, "Oh, this is awful." And like, he really didn't speak a lot, but that was, he was on it. So that's what makes it so like soul crushing though, because you're like, you feel like they're trapped in their own bodies. And I think it really, really speaks to this idea of like our healthcare system. In several of the books I've read recently from palliative care nurses and different people in death and healthcare, like, we've learned to extend lives, but we haven't learned how to extend cognitive ability. And the intersection of that is usually where people's quality of life comes into play. And like, people will be like, "What level of like with it do you want to be?" And they're like, "I want to be able to drink coffee in the morning and read the New York Times. And if I can't read the newspaper, then maybe I can listen to the recording. And if I can't do that, like, fuck it, I'm out." Like, there just is this, and everybody's line in the sand is different. And so when we don't talk about it, then we all have to guess. And then if it's like an older parent or a younger parent, the kids have to assume what their parent might want while trying to slog through the fact that they're projecting all of their own ideas anyway. You know, that's where it gets so complicated, uncomfortable.
I want to let Jeff talk, but I had made me think of two things also.
No, you go, because I'll remember. I'm gonna write them down here.
Will you? One main idea was just like what you were talking about with we've been like death chats. We're doing death chats and talking about it because it doesn't need to be that scary, and it's interesting, and we're talking about it in a playful, interesting, curious way. And that is kind of like you said with Alzheimer's, that you're confronted with it. Death is like the final real, it's there. But what you just brought up about like loss and grieving is like the baby step version that also don't get discussed almost ever, which is a really interesting idea that I'm like, oh man, we should be talking about that. But what you also said about the at what point is it worth it, kind of, and I don't know the correct terms, but it's like whether it's legal or not legal for somebody who's in a state of less quality of life and being like, I would like to die now. And that is such like as an individual, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, because like it's kind of my, like, it's not like I'm just gonna like go, it's like a choice, and like there's a formal way that you can do it. And if I don't know how to express what I'm trying to say here, but like, okay, it's not, because there's like, okay, committing suicide is like not a great thing because people were like suffering. But if you're like not totally suffering, but you're just like, okay, like I no longer have use of any of my limbs and I can't do anything for myself, and like I can tell that my mental capacity is starting to go, like that's like the, can I read the newspaper, can I listen to the newspaper? And if you're just like, this is like not fun for me anymore, and if you can, like, that's like an opportunity to like manage it with those you care about, but people don't want that.
Yeah.
And it's such a, like, you should be able to make that, like, I don't want a sweeping generalization, but part of me is like, you should be able to make that choice when you're of sound mind. But it's such a weird, contentious subject and so black and white, but nothing's black and white. So those are the things that I thought of.
Yeah, I thought of the idea of something as basic as, like, let's say you have, loved one that has Alzheimer's and you want to take them out for like lunch or dinner, right? And they might have an episode. I want to live in a world where you could say that at the restaurant and people are like, oh, okay, like that's fine. Oh, they're going to have an outburst, or, oh, they might like try to take something off and we'll just like, I'll have to stop them or whatever it is. And if society was okay with that, if society was just like, oh, okay, that, maybe that person is going through a rough time and I have compassion, maybe people's quality of life would be better. Maybe more, we'd be more open to that. But because we're in such a society, especially in America, of like everything has to be so perfect, and like my life is perfect, my family is perfect, all this stuff is that you don't feel comfortable going outside. Like I know I could see my dad dying before he was dying because he was connecting with less and less people every day. Like you could just see it. He wanted to go out less. He wanted to interact less with people. Less people were calling. He was calling people less. Just like, and that kind of like ties in with the other thing I was going to say about like the idea of like even death with retirement. You spoke, Julia, about like the idea of transition. There's a lot of people that, because America's all about, tying your identity to work, that when you retire, it was a huge, massive death for him because he didn't know what to do next. And because he didn't know what to do next, like, then there was nothing else. And it was just like, what is my other purpose for like being here? And I think we're in such a rush all the time from getting to one transition to the next transition to the next transition that we never really like even reflect on what we're letting go of, and how we feel about that. Even like me moving out of my childhood home, like I was like hugging each room and I'm like, man, I'm never going to be in this place ever again. Or if I am, I actually got to go back there. It was super weird, but like, it's not going to be my place anymore. And I don't think we spend enough time talking and appreciating the transitions because we're in such a rush to get to the next thing.
I have so many thoughts. Try to collect them in an order. I think there's so much of it's born out of the fact that we just don't have a lot of emotional tools. Like people just run away from scary things, and it's scary to think, just to grieve. It's scary to lose. It's scary to feel sad. But it's so normal. Like that's the part that I think I won't go down this avenue, but meditation for me has been a beautiful way of being like, yeah, you can do it. Like you can sit with it. That's what it's about. Like just being with it. And I think there are so many losses that we just never name as losses. And it makes such a huge difference just to name it. We're like, oh, yeah, okay. And I think there's because we try to keep ourselves emotionally safe. Then we also do that for other people. That's where all the euphemisms come in.
Yeah.
Even when people say like, I lost my mom or I lost my whatever, it's like, she died. Like I understand, and I do it too. It's not like I don't do it, but I've been trying my best. The death positive movement is like, can we just call it what it is?
Right.
It doesn't have to be it literally just means that they are not living anymore. It doesn't mean
Right.
it's not a judgment on them. It's like not anything, but we dance around it. And that really reminded me of what you were saying, Lauren, about sort of assisted suicide and like assisted death, I guess. I can't remember the exact term. But it's really such a slippery slope because you have to be like medically cleared to do so. And I understand that there's a difference between medical need and like they need to protect themselves from lawsuits of people who are depressed. But I'm also like, I'm such a like kind of pseudo libertarian that I'm like, isn't that like, shouldn't that be that individual person's choice? I mean, like, if I would like to die for whatever reason, is it not weird that the system says, you know what, we don't think you should die, so you have to just like go on your merry way? And I get that there's a huge gray area there. That's a really sticky space. And there's a lot of people who are suicidal who several years down the line say, I'm so glad I didn't look at all the beautiful things I've been able to do. But for example, my mother-in-law committed suicide and she was in her late 50s. And it was a combination of so many things. And part of it being that there wasn't any assisted suicide options in Illinois. And she wanted to refuse treatment if her cancer returned, which I suspect it had, and she just hadn't told us. But she also had a ton of chronic pain and a childhood of a lot of trauma and a lot of stuff, and also a loss of identity. Like her sons are grown, and like she kind of passed the torch to me to be the kind of like maternal, you know, sort of like female, like, okay, like I'll hold down the fort for you kind of thing. And she was just kind of like, my work here is done. From our perspective, like I would love to be able to call her and share things with her and, you know, like the people left behind. But I also deeply respect that, like, she thought real long and hard about that. And it's weird that suicide is technically a crime. Like you're not technically legally allowed to kill yourself, even though what does that even mean? Like what? So many things came up for me. Yeah, that's
why is it like the transitions and the death or loss or ending and grieving of things, whether it's people or chapters in a life or whatever, like is it in the culture that's like we can't know that like from birth, right? Like at some point that becomes, I don't know if it's important, but like supported as like that's the way that we just don't talk about that. And I was trying to think if there was either a time that I like if I could recognize, I was like, when did that feel like I wasn't supposed to talk about something, or if something was weird? Or is there like one sliver of our culture or life or hobbies or something that it seems fine and it's like weirdly okay to like grieve, transition, like it, and I haven't come up with anything yet.
Breakups.
But ooh, that is true.
Wait, say that again?
Breakups, like,
but also, I mean, there's lots of kinds of relationships, like men, women, whatever mix you've got going on. But I will say, I feel like it's the feelings thing. More often, women get to manage those transitions more than men either are practiced or given space to. But that is a really great one. That is a like you broke up and people are like, oh, I'm so sorry. And like you kind of like feel it for a minute or whatever. That's a great point.
I think there definitely is some aspect, I don't know where it comes from, you know, but this aspect of like, if you talk about it, it's more likely to happen, right? Like, let's not talk about COVID and then COVID won't happen to me. let's not talk about death and death what won't happen to me. Even I remember my dad, when my dad would go to the hospital, a lot of his doctor friends wouldn't visit him because they don't want to see another doctor on their deathbed. Like, it was weird for them, like they didn't call him after retirement. Like, there's just like certain things, and these are doctors, right? They're around death all the time. But also when they see one of their colleagues around it, then they avoid it. Like, that didn't really make sense. Like, you would think they would just be like, oh, let's talk about it, but they don't want to talk about it, so they're the worst patients because they like, and I don't know. There was this moment, my sister told me about this recently. There was this moment when my dad was, I think, at the Mayo Clinic. This is where he went to school. So like he went back there to get some procedure done because he like really was important. It's a really important and hard procedure. And he trusted only the Mayo Clinic to do it. And when he was there, I think it was like a resident or someone that was just a new doctor that was like his main doctor. And they would like get into arguments, and really it was just like my dad just using his power over like this kid who just was like from like Ukraine and just like getting abused by him, and probably a smart kid, but my dad was just like, you don't know what you're talking about. And my sister talked about how she was in there without him, and then the Ukrainian doctor had like left, and he just like, he looked so sad because I think it was for the first time he realized that he couldn't fix himself, and that he had to depend on other people, and that maybe they couldn't fix him either. And it was just like, oh. And I wish at that point that would have been like, he would have said something, but he didn't. He just sat there really sad. And then my sister didn't know what to say. And in a place where we would have been comfortable to talk about stuff, it would just be like, what if the conversation was different? What if the conversation was, I don't think this is going to happen. Like, for me to get surgery, it's, what was it? He was like, it was like a 20 or 30% chance of death, 10% chance of paralysis, which is like really high for his surgery. And he should have just been able to be like, I don't know what's going to happen, but let's talk about this openly. And he had talked to that openly with his family. Like, maybe we would just have a different relationship with how we talk to him for like the next 4 or 5 years. Like, I would fly back all the time to see him, but my sister didn't. And now she regrets it, and that one conversation would change their whole relationship for the last 5 years of his life, instead of him feeling isolated. So yeah, we're just so scared to talk about it.
The denial runs really deep, and it's kind of confusing to like look back on denial and be like, why was it better to like dance around it? I think I described it recently, maybe to my therapist, maybe to somebody else too, where it's sort of like you're in the ocean and there's waves coming and it's like gonna hit you, and you're like standing there with like a boogie board, like it's fine, and it like keeps you a little dry, but like the next one just bonks you in the head, and it's like, you could just swim into the wave and then it works well, and then it just crashes over you and it's fine. Like, I just feel sad that like for some reason we all think that's the right way to handle, like the safest emotional way to handle it, when just like diving in and talking about it is actually like usually goes pretty well. I don't know.
I think we think death is contagious, and if we talk about it, we're more likely to die.
Totally. I'm like, sorry guys, you're all gonna die. It's fine. You'll be fine.
But if I talk about it, I'm gonna die earlier. Like, there's
course.
something like weird about that, right?
It's like when people say they have head lice and your head itches, like you're just like, I need to be away from you. The same reaction. Like,
yeah.
I feel that I feel like the lice thing's real though.
Yeah,
like,
it is.
No, yeah.
I don't know. It feels
I was like, even just talking about it, I'm like, don't.
You're like, oh my gosh, I think I have it.
Jeff is
oh
like,
my gosh,
I'm
it just
good.
happened.
Yeah.
Why did you bring it up? You shouldn't have brought it up.
Jeff's living in 2030. Yeah.
I mean,
But
I
okay.
don't know. I saw this recent report, which was so fascinating to me. They were interviewing people in North Carolina, which I guess has really low vaccination rates, or a certain part of North Carolina had really low vaccination rates. So this person goes and interviews all these people in this certain town and asks them, how come you're not vaccinated? And this one mother, her 8-year-old kid had just had COVID and had COVID for like 3-4 weeks, and it was bad, really bad. And then she turns to the mom and was like, so are you going to get vaccinated? She's like, nope, never. Like, and she just experienced this. And like, I'm fascinated with the cognitive dissonance between, you know, death is like potentially at my door, and also I'm invincible. The amount of people that I feel that believe I'm invincible, even when death is happening around them, is so, I don't know, just significant. And I don't know how we can both avoid talking about death and then also be around it enough, like, you know, whether it's gun violence or COVID or whatever it is, or diabetes because people eat really badly. And then we think, oh man, that person died of a heart attack. Let me go have another McDonald's, because that's not going to happen to me. I mean, I understand why he was like 260 pounds, but I'm 250. So like, it's not as bad, like the fascination with our ability to justify, like not addressing it is, it floors me.
Lauren, you look thoughtful.
I mean, the things that, okay, the words that keep coming up in my head that I'm not sure that I can explain yet, which is why I'm like, does this make sense? Like, I'm just like, there's something about like feelings versus function. I don't know what to do with that, but I feel like it's come up a couple times in all of this conversation, but I don't have enough, like a strong enough like case for why that keeps happening.
But can you explain what you mean by feelings and then function?
No, maybe not, which is why I was just like, why did this pop in my head? I'm trying to like figure out.
Because I feel like you're going somewhere that I think is powerful.
Like, I don't know if I know. So chime in if something makes more sense to you than whatever's coming out of my mouth. But yeah, I don't know. There's just something about like I don't know, something with like death things, or when there's impending death, and like your feelings versus the functionality, or like the structure, like the logic versus feelings. Maybe the logic is what I mean in terms of function. There's the logic versus feelings, and I feel like those butt heads constantly around all of this, and whether that's me individually versus like the logic around me, or like the logic of, I mean, I guess it's still bad, but like if I could, like, for length of life, like I should eat healthy and work out, and then I was like, nope, I'm gonna watch Netflix and eat this buttered popcorn and pizza, but like but it makes me happy, but like the function and the logic of those things, so there's something to that too. With, I feel like when like a death around you happens, and there's like the function of it happening, but like your feelings, which have nothing to do with the logic of what's happening or their feelings. And then also, again, I don't really know where this is going, but it keeps coming back up. Like, even with what you were just talking about, Jeff, I was like, okay, I feel like there's something here, but I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else more than
Julia. I don't know if I'm picking up what you're actually hoping to say, but what comes up for me when you're talking about that is just this, like, people acting out of, like, I guess actions and emotions get really intertangled. So there's this sense of like, people don't want their parent to die because they're too sad to let them die. but the actuality is that they're dying or they're sick or they're really uncomfortable, they're really unhappy, the parent is really unhappy, but the sad kid is like, I can't let that happen, sort of. So that was like
Yeah.
piece
Interesting.
A. And then also, like, just because we can't sit with big feelings means that we're usually acting out of a place of avoidance, or it feeding the emotion as opposed to going with the situation as a like logical, logistical, these
That's
are
what
the
it was
things
like.
that maybe need to happen.
Like with Jeff's things of like the death is happening around me, but it's like the avoidance denial of like, nope, it's fine. Like I'm fine.
Yeah.
Like I'm gonna just go about my life.
Yeah, like I've seen it firsthand. Like I remember, my dad was dying. It was clear that he was going to probably die within the next 3 to 5 years, right? Like I think he was diagnosed or had his issue in 2010 and he passed away in 2015. So that was about 5 years. But I think my sister visited less. I don't know. I'm not sure, but I've seen this in other cases with people where they don't want to see it. And they feel as if they don't see it, then it's less likely it's going to happen, instead of like acknowledging what is actually happening and being like, what do I want to do now, knowing that this is a strong possibility.
This feels like it goes back to the transitions thing, right? Loss, grief, transition, death of things or people or time, whatever.
Yeah.
Because it's like these times of transition, but like we potentially don't want to let go of that house or that job. We're like, oh, I loved all the people, but like there's this great new thing, but you're like, oh. Or if it is like Alzheimer's or death of or dying of a loved person or animal, it's the feeling of like what it was, and you can't be in the like you almost refusal to be in the present because you're like holding on to this historical version. And so like, and maybe that's where I'm kind of going, where there's this like weird dichotomy that or whatever that happens where it's just like, are you gonna go with it or like kind of denial, hold on to this other thing that you like don't want to let go of because it's hard, and the feelings and like the new and the now and the present and whatever's actually happening. And I don't know what to do with that or about it.
I mean, it's weird. I feel as if I've been able to handle some transitions better simply because I'm more of a play-oriented person.
What kind of transitions? Like lots of like any?
Yeah, many. Yeah, like me moving out of my apartment, even when I broke up with somebody, death. I mean, I'm not saying I don't want to, it's not me bragging. This is like, I think because I'm in such a play-oriented mindset of like the way in which I used to play in the playground, where you like play with somebody and then you're like, all right, see you later. I may never see you again. Goodbye. Like whatever. Like that is just more of my world, that even when like we moved out of my parents' house, I was like, it was really sad. But then after I hugged every room, I was like, okay, I'm ready to go. Meanwhile, my sister like still misses the house. Like we walked by there the other day when she was visiting, and it was just like, oh, I wish we're still at the house. And I'm like, it's just not, I don't feel that anymore, because I feel like I did the process that I needed to do to be able to let go of it. Right. And I don't know. I feel like most people are just really scared of being in the present. It's just a scary, vulnerable place. Like I remember during COVID when I would make videos, and I still think this sometimes, is like, I'd be like, this might be my last video. I might die tomorrow. okay, let me make this video. Like, I was thinking that, like, if I could do anything, let me make this video. And if this is the last video I ever make, great. This is what people are going to watch when I'm dead. And that it's both really morbid and also like really was motivating to me. It like made me do all these things I would have otherwise not done. And I think a lot of times we're scared of thinking like that.
I know that this goes to the individual, like versus like others, but you saying that, I feel like that's so interesting because like that's how you see it. But I could see so many other people be like, this could be the last movie that I watch. Like, am I really gonna watch How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days as the last movie I ever watched? Like there's the opposite exact.
You would make different choices though, right? You would be like, do I really want to watch Die Hard for the 1,000th time? Well, actually, maybe I do. Maybe I don't.
Like some people might be like, it's fine. But it's like, because you're just like, okay, well, I'm going to make this thing. But other people might be like, oh my God, I should be doing something else. But then it almost gets like too like grand. And then you don't do anything.
Yes.
True.
There's a lot of that. I mean, intentional living is my jam. But it's just that it's really understanding what it is that you want and you need. Like, yeah, I totally watched Too Hot to Handle. Like, I just did. I totally did. It took a couple days. We watched a bunch of episodes and like I was good with it. Like I just have to trust that my decision at the time was the decision I wanted to make at the time. And then like I'm good. But there is this that makes me think a lot about how, Jeff, when you were talking about how your sister's reaction to the house is so different, and that totally speaks to grief in general, because it's particularly with a family, but it can be friends, friend group, college friends when you all graduate. Like you're all going to handle that transition differently. But when you're planning a funeral, you are required to do it together. And that's the hardest part because everybody's like ignoring the upselling and that horrible stuff. You also have to be like holding space for people. In a time when like you just need someone to hold space for you, and you all have to like not judge each other's process, but we judge processes to understand our own. And so it all just gets jumbled up together. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of people that cannot get down with the present moment, and for sure do not want to talk about impermanence, the beauty of impermanence. Like to me, that's what you're talking about. And with play and being like, see you later. Maybe I'll never see you again. It's fine. Like
it was great.
What we had was beautiful, and that was it. It didn't need to be more. You didn't have to like grasp onto it. But
one of my most distinctive memories of that time when dealing with the funeral was, I didn't think, now I have more compassion, but at the time, I didn't know how my sisters were handling it, because like I would ask them to do certain things and sometimes they just couldn't do it. So I was like, okay, let me just figure out like really easy things for them to do. So I remember going to Office Depot to buy like this, like, I don't know, one of those like white sheets, because we were going to put a bunch of pictures up there. Right. And she was going to help, my nephews make these collages. And I remember as I'm looking for this, I don't know what to do, because I'm like going through this grieving process, freaking looking for these like poster boards. And I'm like, what am I doing? So this is when I called Lauren and I was like, Lauren, I need to vent because I know you've gone through this. Why am I helping people mourn over the phone when I'm trying to like make phone calls to people to let them know about the logistics of this, funeral? And I feel like I'm like having to help all these other people through this process. And I was like, and like she it was such an important part for me, because she was just like, yeah, it sucks, and it was just like, just knowing that there was somebody, because there was no one else. There was really nobody else that I knew that had gone through this. And I was just like, it was such an important time for me. Thank you so much, Lauren. It was really, no, but it was really like important, because I was like, I do not feel seen. And I'm also, it's just so fucked up. Like it's all weird and crazy and emotional roller coaster. And she had like a calming presence of like, yeah, it's ridiculous. And a validation that like I wasn't crazy during this time, because other people around me were not acting like I was. Like, just like Lauren said earlier, it's like I was just like, okay, what's the next thing we have to do? Okay, people to call, things to do, who to invite, what food to get. Like, that was my way of coping. And other people don't cope that way.
I think that that's actually a big, like, again, the people you get left behind, we're all different, and we all manage feelings or processing or grieving or not grieving or whatever differently. And it's so hard with the systems or structures that aren't in place, because most people are not, we don't have practice from life to deal with the major losses, whatever that might be, whether it's a breakup or a death or a displacement or something. We don't have the practices. So then when we are put in those places, if it is death, maybe your job gives you like bereavement pay or like those like days off, but like maybe it's like you get like 2 in a year. Chaos for recently, maybe. But like they like maybe give you time off. But like if you don't know how to process, it's like, do any of my friends or family members know how to process? And then we're putting it on other people who also may or may not know how to process. And it's just like, do we just need like required death therapists for like, just like, it's just a standard, everybody gets one day, like just to check in situation? Because no, we don't know how to handle it. And then we're all forcing other people to help us handle it. And they're trying to get us to help, and we're trying to ask for their help, and none of us know what to do. And we aren't given space to like sit in it or deal with logistics. It's just like, oh yeah, you got to plan all this stuff. Cool. You get like 2 days off of work. And you're like, no, I can't do this. And I just like want, like, what, like, because none of that exists, like, what are the things that people can do when you're forced to process? But like, I mean, I guess find therapy or practice more in the baby steps, but like, that's also really hard to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard too, because there isn't kind of a one size fits all. I mean, some people
Right.
are not verbal processors and they're not going to want to talk about anything, or it'll take them a year to come around to wanting to talk about it. Or, you know, it's like, that's what makes it really tricky, because there isn't just this like, okay, someone's died, here are the 10 steps you can do to like feel better.
Yeah.
Because ultimately part of it is driven by wanting to not feel bad. And that makes sense. That's a normal, like, human reaction to things. And it's not unhealthy. I mean, it would be unhealthy to wallow in your sadness in the same way. You know, like, processing and wallowing are very different. And yeah, they're just, it feels like we know that when someone dies, we either call a funeral director or some other external source who sort of handholds us through the basics of the thing that we definitely did not know what the fuck needed to happen for that. And but like a week later, when all of the like festivities are done, you're still just like, it's, you feel like someone just dropped you on a street corner somewhere, and you're like, so what happens now? Where do I go?
And the grief comes in waves, right? Like, you don't know when the grief is actually going to hit. I heard this, like, you know, trying to answer your question, Lauren, like, I heard this really disturbing story. It was at this workplace where, you know, this employee dies, you know, and then they send out an email to everyone. And I think this is, I don't know, some people were in the office and some people were not. And they were just like, hey, if you got to take a mental health day, you know, we totally understand. And then HR posted the job of that person that same day. Like, it was like, and the person that was describing the story was just like, what, you know, the premise was like, what have you learned from a job that you'll never forget. And they were like, how quickly replaceable I am. Like seeing that HR was posting that job that day, the day they died, or maybe it was like the day right after they died, just shows how crazy, manic, and scary this capitalistic system is. That it's just like, just keep the machine moving. Like, don't worry about, oh, did you have a miscarriage? Who cares? Keep going. Like I just read there's new legislation that should have been implemented a really long time ago by some congresswomen who were like, a miscarriage is a death. Like that also should be mourned as well. Like, are we not? And that bereavement of 2 days or how many days is just sad, dude. It's just like, what are you talking about? And that these things don't match up. That you can have humanity around death and also be working for this capitalistic system that does not acknowledge that. You can't keep the machine going that way. You know,
there's a lot of feelings in the business.
And this is the problem that I believe is happening right now with, you know, like the whole idea of like the great resignation and people quitting and all that, is because they're like, it's not that important. It's just, my work is just not that important that I'm willing to just like walk off the job. And you see so many people doing that because like they think they saw people die directly. And they were like, why am I going back to some place that's abusive, you know, and really doesn't care about my entire life. They just care about what I can produce for them.
Yeah, I worry about that a lot with healthcare workers, especially with COVID, but just in general, because they, on one hand, they like their 12-hour days because then they get 3 days a week. But on the other hand, like, who's going to aspire to be a doctor or a nurse now? Like, who's, and you know, they, to your point of like when your dad retired, like no one reached out because they just can't function. In order to function in healthcare, in my opinion, as it stands right now, you have to have zero emotions.
Yeah.
You cannot feel anything because it's just going to get in the way of helping the next person, which on one hand is noble and on the other hand is like a surefire way to give everyone burnout and cancer and just, oh man, just totally shrivel.
I mean, they were interviewing on CNN for that North Carolina story about COVID. They were interviewing a nurse and she's like, I did not sign up for this. When I signed up to the military, I knew I was putting my life on the line. But when I signed up as a nurse, I was there to take care of people. I wasn't there to like watch death. I wasn't there to put my life on the line, like all throughout COVID. Like, this is just not what I signed up for. And I don't, and so the amount of PTSD that's going to come from this, whoa, dude.
That's a whole nother version of like those left behind, right? Like the people who's like in the, I don't want to call it an industry, but whose field of work, they get left behind after death happens. Other than like the loved ones version of things. And like, that's like a whole different category of people to consider that I don't know what's going to happen with that. Cause that's, I feel like that's again, kind of like not exactly, but it's like the feelings and the function part of things where you're like, it can't be both most of the time. It'd be great if it could be, but very often it's just like, nope, I'm choosing feelings or function or logic or whatever. And I don't know, that's part of like how do we all process things, which is all different. Everything's hard.
Like circling back to the idea of death doulas, imagine if that was an actual viable profession and what role that would have played during COVID. Everyone that was saying goodbye to people on their phones, like on FaceTime and on their iPads, or had to stand behind, they could like see them from like the glass. Like, those were the times in which those doulas were needed, just to be like, to process, what am I supposed to say to my father? He's about to die. What am I supposed to say? to like my loved one, what am I supposed to say to my son? His mom just died. Like, that's when it was needed.
Yeah. And I mean, it really, the institutionalization of death is a huge conversation in like the death care industry, because it's like 100 years ago, people still died at home and they had ice and they'd bring ice around and then keep the body on ice for a while and people would come and pay their respects. And depending on your tradition, of course, heritage and religion and all of that, but generally speaking, people died at home. And we just got so far away from that.
Yeah.
And I understand the logistics of like, if someone's on a life support or something because it was an accident and then they've died, like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, they're trying to revive them. That's what they would have wanted, an attempt. But to the point of, there's a lot of people, 70, 80, 90-year-olds, hundreds, that are like, can I just go home?
Yeah.
Why do I have to die here? Like, do
Yeah.
I really need to be in the hospital? I'm dying at the end of this, however we slice it. Can I just go home? And that's
Right.
a big part of, at least that I understand, of the UK palliative care, is like setting people up in beds. And I do think that, I hope that palliative care, talking about hospice, hopefully then it's a shift towards palliative care, and death doulas can really be a like respected resource, as opposed to like the grim reaper, like, heaven forbid you ever say the word hospice. And it's like, no, but a death doula is just there to say, like, I'm not in denial that I'm going to die and this is how I want it to look. And it, they talk a lot in death doulas will talk to people about what it means to die a good death. And that looks very, very different to everybody, but there are a lot of big picture systems at work there too. And how can we work against them in a lot of ways to give people their individual version of dying how they would like to die?
There's something powerful about that question. What would you consider a good death? And I remember even seeing this, I don't know, Black Widow. This was in Black Widow. Great movie. But this person, she was like in her 20s, and she was just like, this is going to be a good death. Like, she was about to die, but it was this idea of just also accepting, like, yeah, I might live, I might not. And I don't really, like, there's nothing sad about it. It's just like, this is how I would have wanted to die. I don't know, it's really powerful. And I think about what you said earlier about, dying at home. Like, in the Philippines, a lot of times they would have the coffin in the house, the body's in the house. Like, the person dies in the house, but then they leave the coffin in the house, sometimes for like 5 to 10 days, for people to just hang out with it. So then it's not that big of a deal that there's a body of that person in there. And then when they bury the body, then they go and hang out at the cemetery and like have picnics around it every year. Like, they're just chilling around it. That is not a thing that is celebrated in America. Like, we go quickly, drop some flowers off, and then we're gone. Like, yeah.
And pretend like there aren't other graves there too.
Right.
Like tunnel vision, like,
yeah.
I'm just walking here.
This one's mine.
That is actually really interesting. I feel like we may have talked about this at one point, but I don't really remember. We've covered a lot of ground in all of these. But like,
I love these conversations.
It's the thing of again, those left behind, and how do you? There's the immediate like loss and grieving, or maybe not immediate, but initial grieving period. But then, for me, I'm left behind of people that I've lost. And so like, for me, it's like there's a moment, like it took a minute to get here, but that sort of like playground mentality of like, it was really great. And like, these are the memories that I have. And maybe that's not always the case for people that you know. That's fine. But like holding on to the good memories or the legacy, like the legacies without it being like this is my legacy, but like whatever I still hold with me. But that's how I feel like I remember and honor, cherish whatever people, or like if people have like pets that they've cared about, you're just like, oh, like remember when my cat did that dumb thing or what, there's just like those like moments and memories. But I don't, that's a lie. This is about to be a lie. It wasn't. Anyway. I don't have a traditional, like some people I know, I don't do this, but like either on someone's since deceased's birthday or death day will like do a thing. And I've never done that. And so when I first found out that somebody I knew did that, I was just like, wait, what are you doing? Like, you're going to get together for their birthday? Okay, that's different. My almost lie was to me, I was like, I don't do anything like that. And I don't on a regular basis, but my sister and I spread ashes in a certain space. So like when we get a chance, we try to like travel vacation there and like have a little vacation, but also like go to this spot and like do like a flower thing or something and like have a moment. But it's not an annual tradition per se, but it is like a space for active remembrance versus like passively just like, oh, like that reminds me of my mom or dad or whatever. I think that that's actually really interesting, different people's cultures or individuals takes on like the cemetery picnic situation, because like I didn't do that as much growing up, but I do know that happens in a lot of generally Asian cultures do that, or like, but it's not necessarily on like their birth or death day. It's like a seasonal, it's like a holiday that like everybody does it, kind of like Dia de los Muertos, where it's like that's the time, like this is the time. And that's super interesting to me. And I feel like I don't want to be like everyone should have more of that, but if there were more space for that, the transition would be less sucky.
Yeah. I didn't want to talk over you. I think we did the same thing. In the like death care world, there is a lot of like, we would be better off if people had much stronger rituals, because that's the purpose of a ritual. And it really does help us process and gives us space to feel how we're feeling and just process through emotions and do it together with people, ideally. Like, of course, your ritual can be by yourself, but part of it, I think, is this community aspect of that. And I do think that that's really important and something that a lot of us have lost, whether it's like assimilation or maybe other factors, but I think that has a lot to do with it, where it's just like, well, what are the annual traditions or and can I adopt someone else's tradition and just,
right,
or the options out there, like what does anyone else do so that I can do something?
Well, I think of, because I had to look this up, but I think of the Pixar movie Coco, right? And how like they celebrate death in that idea of like, don't forget the person, and how do you not forget the person? You play their music, you talk about them, you like, this is the process that I feel we could cope better with death if we were willing to continue to talk about that person. But I feel as if, especially in America, it's almost like, okay, that person died, let's have the funeral. All right, never to talk about that person again. And even now, as I'm trying to gather stories of my dad, like 7 years later, it's interesting because some people are really open to sharing and others are like more, I don't know, just scared, or I don't know. I really don't know. Yeah, so if there's like one thing that I would like take away from this conversation is that if you want to embrace death more and be more comfortable with death, then be more comfortable talking about the dying, the people that are already passed away. And just talking, either talking about them with others or talking to them directly. Because I think I said this earlier in another, but there was this, I forgot his name now, but he taught me such a fascinating like experiment where he was just like, oh yeah, I love my grandfather. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. He's like, yeah, we're so close. I talk to him all the time, you know. We sometimes have like 30-minute, hour-long conversations. I was like, oh, cool. How old is he? And he's like, he passed away like 10 years ago. But I have conversations with him all the time. And he was just, and then he started welling up, like just started tearing up as he just described him. Like, because you felt like he was there with him as he's describing him to me, who I don't even know anything about his grandpa, but now I want to know his grandpa. And now I actually do know something about him. So like there's something powerful there. Yeah.
I had like one other thing that I think kind of sums up some of what I've talked about today. Lauren, when you were talking, I was thinking about how deeply we don't grieve the losses of ourselves all the time. And when someone in your life dies, you are inherently different than you were probably maybe a minute ago or whenever you found out about it. You know, it's like, and learning to be with that grief and that sort of forced change in oneself, I think, is one of the hardest parts about grieving and loss. So I think it's very like food for thought. Just the more that we can acknowledge and name losses every day, even if it's like, oh, my guacamole is done, that makes me feel sad. Like that practice is the same muscle and like neural pathways from when someone you love dies or a pet. And that's where the practice, I think, can come in a little bit. It's like, oh, I'm gonna try that.
I love both of the things that both of you said, and Julie, what you just said about guacamole made me think of my partner who we were in Japan and we were at a ramen place and he had like one bite of this ramen. He's like, I'm so sad. I was like, why? It's like, I'm never gonna have ramen this good ever again. I was like, can you just enjoy it? So balance. Maybe wait till it's actually done.
Yeah.
And then you can like a little. But yes, I was just like, oh man, this feels so real. But I also was gonna say, like, I appreciate I feel like I have like a little bits of both of what you're saying. Feels like sort of what are my takeaways from this conversation. It's just like we need to practice, and I see that in both ways that you all said, which one is just like the like losses, like the kind of like even the regular, the little losses or like the normal day things, like when people like stop trying to be fine when things are hard or your life circumstances have changed or whatever. I know that going through life, sometimes when you do the like, how are you doing? And there's like been that thing lately of like, stop saying you're fine because you're not fine. And that's hard to like identify as a loss, but it's a similar thing of just like when there are losses, just being like, oh, it's fine. We broke up. I'm fine. It's like you might like, are you like, you can be, but also like, are you? So trying to like acknowledge and sit in that, big, little, all the things, practice. And then kind of like the replay practice, but in the good version of like memory versus like living in the past, but just like it is like the holding on to the good, because that is for you and potentially for them. It's kind of like how in history things that have survived on and hopefully are good things, but are like the quotes from like really great people who've like made, and like Maya Angelou has like said great quotes and like lives on through that because things get read and people share it and there's quotes and there's poetry, and that can happen at small scale with unknown people too, like friends, family, whatever. And in those stories or in those sayings or in like how that shapes you, and like that is, I know that not everybody wants to like share and process out loud. But like one of the things that I've done, because I was like, I don't know if I processed the best in times of death around me. But when I have that with other people, or when I've experienced that, someone else has experienced that, and I find out, my two responses are usually, do you want me to just come like sit with you? And if at any point, I'd love to hear some stories about this person who seemed really cool. Because usually there's like a post or something about like, this person was so great and I've lost them. And I'm just like, they do sound great. I'd love to hear about them sometime, because it's hard to just be like, so this one time my dad, like, you don't, it's hard to bring up out of nowhere. So like trying to create spaces for memories or ritual or sharing for whoever. Practice.
I will say this one last takeaway that I have to share, especially for you, Julia, which you may not know. But Lauren and I recently were, going through like, wow, we're part of a lot of groups and we're part of a lot of conversations, and that takes up a lot of time, and which ones are really important to us. So we like wrote them all down. We like did this whole process and wrote them down, and we're like, oh my gosh, we're part of so much different stuff. And then we ranked them to be like, what are really important ones? What are not? What are like ones, that used to be important, but not anymore. But what stood out quite high, even though it wasn't like a consistent thing, is these conversations. These 6 conversations, which we've had over what now, like a year and a half. Probably, one of the most fascinating and most growth infused times for me, because I feel like I'm expanded with each and every one of these. And I don't know why, but I think it's just because not only am I challenged to talk about something that I usually don't want to talk about, but it really does provide more context for like, okay, what is actually important to me and how I want to show up in the world? Because like I could die tomorrow. And if that, like, knowing what I know now, listening to both of you, I'm like, what is good death? What is a good death? And how do I have that? Like, that's fascinating to me. And if I embrace that idea of having a good death, I almost believe by doing that, I would have a better life. Whether I die tomorrow or I died like 40 years from now, right? Because I'm okay with it.
Be in that present.
It's where it's at.
I like that. That's our slogan. Death chats. Live in the present. That's where it's at.
Yeah.
Death chats. Live in the present. That's where it's at. Okay, so I feel like we're kind of wrapping up here. Again, if we ever do post these, like, I am Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play and Rediscover Your Play Through Death.
Hey, I'm Julia Deaconeva. I'm a life coach who's obsessed with death, so
and I'm Lauren Yee. I'm a cultivator of curiosity, and I work with This Us Now. And thanks for maybe listening to us talk forever.
Amazing. Thank you.